There's a new epidemic on our hands, and it's one that I think we're all aware of, but not actually talking about enough. And it's the epidemic of not feeling enough, feeling like you're doing enough, being enough, seeing enough, experiencing enough, needing to do more. That seems to be one of the biggest themes which is tackling us now. Now, first of all, why are we feeling this way when maybe 10 years ago we would be feeling enough? There seems to have been something within that 10 years which has conditioned us and shifted us into a not only harmful but inaccurate mindset which doesn't reflect the real world, so to speak. A lot of where we draw our conclusions about the outside world are through our phones and our computers now, which they give us an open window to the world that we've never had before. And although that's fantastic for many reasons, it creates a different kind of benchmark than we had before for where we measure up against. Now, first of all, it's really important to note that what we are displayed online is a kind of hyper-reality, where everything is exaggerated, everything is made for, well, not everything, but a huge amount of the content is exaggerated for the sake of pushing views, for pushing numbers, for making money, for pleasing the algorithm, yada yada yada. And the whole purpose behind that is to grab people's attention. And the things that grab our attention the most are the things that we don't see usually in our world very often. Those are the things we're like, whoa, because it's such a divide between our usual life most of the time and what we're seeing. But the direct side effect of that is we start to think that the reality we're seeing is real and it's what our lives should be. This isn't necessarily a conscious thought, although it can happen, but what that does is it suddenly throws our normal waking hours and our reality into a bit of chaos, because suddenly it's a heck of a lot more mundane than usual. And in the back of our minds, we're starting to think that we're not enough, because what we're seeing on our phones is what we think we should be. Because this is a survival mechanism of the brain that's being exploited. There's a part of our brain which is constantly looking out into the world and seeing where we fit in. It helps us understand where we are in society. But now we're comparing ourselves to something which isn't real, and it was fabricated on the grounds of entertainment rather than being accurate to real life. We begin to compare ourselves to something which doesn't really exist, and ideally we'd be comparing ourselves to things in the real world, right? So what this does over time is we start to think we're not enough, because we have this subconscious collection of things that we've seen that kind of create the new benchmark at which we start comparing our lives to. But we shouldn't have been comparing our lives to that in the first place. So now that we understand a little bit more where that came from, we can start to address it. What usually happens before you understand this is you will just start feeling that your life's not enough. You won't necessarily understand where it's come from. But one of the first things that we do based on this guilt is to try and remedy this feeling by doing more, being more productive. But in essence, that's exactly what the consumerist system wants you to do, because now it has created another producer. It's created another person who is going to be putting more into the world for more consumers to consume. So what do? Well, the first thing is to understand what's happened. And that's really important, to know how you got to where you are. And then basically it's just like a mindset switch. Every time you find yourself thinking that you're not enough, you can realize that these thoughts weren't built on stable ground. They were built on sand, so to speak, because they weren't real. They were knock-on effects of a society which shows us inaccurate life. Just the very knowing that you are thinking in a way that was built on sand and not on stable ground, so to speak, is a really helpful exercise, because it means that you're not fully submitting yourself to that original way of thinking. Let's not forget that the brain often appears very conclusive and absolute, even in situations where it's simply not. For a lot of time, I submitted to it. I was thinking, well, it must be right, That's our first instinct, actually, is to, especially from a survival perspective, we try to fit in with our tribe by being like our tribe. And if our tribe appears to be a heck of a lot better than us, then we should be feeling some kind of divide between us and them. However, the grounds weren't solid to begin with, and we have to understand that. The mind is extremely powerful over time, and I've found that with these kind of repetitious reminders, rational reminders that, I could say to myself, if I was suddenly thinking that I'm not enough, it's like, no, these thoughts aren't true. And you can give it real evidence as to why you are enough. And the brain just needs evidence to form new beliefs over and over again. And if you give it real evidence that you are enough, forget what you're seeing on your screen, It's not reflective of the real world. As soon as you have that evidence, then you can start consciously reminding yourself of the truth. It's only when you submit and go with what the mind's saying that you get pulled into it and start to constantly feel like you're not enough, and you jump on the hamster wheel like a lot of other people. So in other words, if it was your mind that dug this hole, then you can use your mind to dig yourself out of it too. You just need to take a bit more of an active role of what's going on in your head, because it's like no one's leading the pack. It's like it's just going automatically based on instinct, and it needs to have some kind of leader within itself to start seeing how things really are. Otherwise, it's going to act on its own accord and pull you under, when even if you're doing fantastic, that's the other thing. You might actually be a heck of a lot more than enough, even though that's subjective, but still feel the same way, just because there's just absolutely no ceiling to what is enough, and you have to define that for yourself. The point is, if you're using what you're seeing online to define what is enough, then by default you're set up to fail. So we have to detach ourselves from that, come back to reality. Imagine ourselves 10 years ago, before this stuff started to really affect us, and ask ourselves the question again, would we be enough? If I asked that for myself, yes, I think so. I would be. But if I did it now, it's like, because my mind's so aware of all the success and blah 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 in the world, I'd be less likely to. So the key point is to stop comparing ourselves to hyperreality and start coming back to real life in terms of how we are framing our successes. The key is to be aware of when you're thinking that you're not enough based on what you've seen in this hyperreality, and to remind yourself that that's not where reality is, and those aren't the grounds to be comparing yourself under. On a side note, the feeling that we're not enough, just independent of where it came from, is inherently useful, because the reason it's there is to prompt us to do more, and it's certainly not an invalidation of that feeling. It's just being exploited in the way that I've talked about in this video. And so we need to start aligning ourselves to have that feeling again, but under the right pretenses, under the right conditions for it to come up, rather than conditions that simply don't reflect real life and aren't even fair to any extent. Once we understand that, we can start to pull ourselves out of it, but it's going to be a bit uncomfortable, because it's going to be going against the grain, and it's going to be uncomfortable for a while whilst you keep doing this. But over time, you will form new bedrock from which your thoughts come from, and you won't be held under the mystical guise that the online world has anymore. And your thinking and feeling about whether you're enough or not are going to be reverted back to their normal functioning. Perhaps not entirely, but a heck of a lot more so. And it's all about just trying to have realistic and accurate expectations of ourselves, because we're expecting too much. And that's the exact thing that leads to burnout and isolation and just feeling like something's seriously wrong and a bunch of bad stuff that we can avoid